Okay. Namaskar, sir,
Namaskar.
and welcome to Spikmake Anubhav series. We are honored to have you with us in this 7 day international Spikmake Anubhav series. This is bringing the best of Indian culture and heritage to youth all over the world. Now, Dr. Saab is going to enlighten us with his perspective on relevance of Vedant today. Dr. Karan Singh is a multifaceted personality who is a philosopher and scholar statesman like Dr. Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan. He is an eminent educationist, environmentalist, and writer. He has held several important political and diplomatic posts and have also represented India in many international fora. He is an authority on Upanishads, Vedic Vedanta, and cultural heritage. Recognized as an outstanding thinker and speaker and leader internationally, he can mesmerize you with his powerful oratory skills. Also, he is a poet and a music lover and musician. हाँ मैं आ रहा हूँ मैं आ रहा हूँ There is some glitch.
क्या हो गया भाई साहब?
Am I audible?
Your audible
Yes,
is
sir.
not visible.
I can keep on speaking, then Jyotiradit can come in. If there is a hitch, I will set it right.
Sure.
Also, he is a poet and music lover who has composed and recited a number of devotional songs in his mother tongue, Dogri. He has been blessing Spikmake almost since its inception and is presently chairman of advisory board of Spikmake. We'll have a question answer session after the talk. Now I request my young friend Jyotiradit to formally introduce Dr. Karan Singh and take this session forward. Jyotiradit.
Namaskar. I will begin with a brief introduction of Dr. Karan Singh. Dr. Karan Singh was born as Yuvraj of Jammu and Kashmir in 1931 and was appointed regent by his father at an early age of 18 in 1949. He was the only former ruler of a princely state to voluntarily surrender his privy purse and put the entire sum into the Hari Tara Charitable Trust. He was head of Jammu and Kashmir for 18 years as regent, Sadri Riyasat, and governor. At 36, he became the youngest ever Union Cabinet Minister of India under Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. 4 times he was elected as a member of Lok Sabha. He has also been a 4-time member of Rajya Sabha. He held various positions as Minister, Tourism and Civil Aviation, Health and Family Planning, and Education and Culture, without drawing any salary or living in government accommodations. Dr. Karan Singh was married to the gracious Princess Yasho Lakshmi. She and Dr. Karan Singh converted his Amar Mahal Palace in Jammu into a museum and library containing a priceless collection of Pahari miniature paintings and modern Indian art, as well as his personal library of over 20,000 volumes. He has a daughter and 2 sons. Educated from the Doon School, Dehradun, Dr. Karan Singh graduated from the Jammu and Kashmir University, of which he was himself the chancellor. He took the MA degree of the Delhi University in political sciences with a first-class first, creating a university record, still unbeaten till this day. He then earned his doctorate from Delhi University by writing a thesis on the political thought of Sri Aurobindo. Dr. Karan Singh was for many years Chancellor of the Jammu and Kashmir University, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and the Banaras Hindu University. President for the Indian Council of Cultural Relations, ICCR, Chairman of the Central Sanskrit Board, President of the Authors Guild of India, the Commonwealth Society of India, the Delhi Music Society, the India International Center, and member of the UNESCO International Commission on Education, co-chair of the Indo-French Forum, etc., etc. He is chairman of the Auroville Foundation and the Temple of Understanding, a major global interfaith association. He has received several honorary doctorates and awards, including doctorates from the Banaras Hindu University, the Aligarh Muslim University, the Soka University of Tokyo, and the Shenzhen University in China. He is an honorary Major General in the Indian Army too. He is a lifelong conservationist, having been chairman of the Indian Board of Wildlife and head of the wildly successful Project Tiger. He was awarded Padma Vibhushan in 2005. We welcome you, sir, to
Are we ready? Let's start. Well, thank you.
Yes, sir, please.
Thank both of you for that very generous introduction. Let me say at the outset that I have been involved with Spic McKay literally since it was started by Kiran Seth in 1977, and it has really done wonders. It has grown into an extraordinary institution which has 300 branches around India and the world, and which has taken Indian culture to millions of young people all over India and outside India also. So first of all, I want to pay my homage to Spic McKay and particularly congratulate Kiran Seth, because this was a one-man startup and today it has become a global institution. It's an honor for me to chair the advisory committee. Today, I have been requested to speak on the significance of Vedanta today. Now, friends, we live in very difficult times. As it was difficult even before this COVID hit us. Now it has become more painful and more uncomfortable. And otherwise also, the old is disappearing and the new is struggling to be born. And we are facing a generation which is caught between a vanishing past and an indeterminate future. At a time like this, we look into our scriptures to get the inspiration, the wisdom and the courage to go forward boldly in this age. Now, Hinduism has been blessed with a very, very rich scriptural heritage. Probably the oldest continuing spiritual heritage in the world, the Vedas, at least 3,000 to 5,000 BC, and these glorious hymns to various deities. And then there are the Brahmanas, the Aranyakas, and then at the end of each Vedic collection, they are the Upanishads. Now the Upanishads are the wisdom part of the Vedas. And they represent, to my mind, the high watermark not only of Indian but of world philosophy. The Upanishads are dialogues. Always remember that Indic religions are dialogic religions. We are not revealed religion that here is a text, take it or leave it. No. We have question and answer. The Upanishads themselves are dialogues between the Guru and the one or more disciples. Very sharp questions are asked. Why are we here? What is the purpose of life? What is the end of our existence? Who is it that inspires us to move and so on? So these dialogues are the Upanishads. And the Upanishad has two meanings. One is sitting around the Guru, and the other is a secret teaching. Secret meaning it should be given only to people who can really understand it. The disciple also has to be ready. There are a large number of Upanishads, but there are 11 major Upanishads. And they are so full of content and they are so vast and varied that it is difficult to encapsulate their teachings. But I will do so because I believe that the teaching of the Upanishads are in fact becoming more relevant as we move on. Always remember, a scripture is as useful as it helps us today. What it might have done in the past is interesting but not important for us. If it doesn't impact us today, then it is no longer really relevant. So I have abstracted some key concepts from the Upanishads, which I think I will place before you in this talk. The first basic concept, remember, is the all-pervasive Brahman. The concept that entire cosmos, whatever has been, whatever is, whatever will be, is illuminated by, is inhabited by the same divine power. That divine power is known as the Brahman. And that is something which is highlighted in the Upanishads. The second important point to remember is that each one of us encapsulates a spark of that divine. This is what is so extraordinary. Ishvara sarva bhutanam hrideshe tishtati. The Lord resides in the heart of all beings. Madhya vamanamasinam vishve deva upasti. In the middle of our hearts we have that spark. And that is known as the Atman. So you have the Brahman, which is the all-pervasive divine. You have the Atman, which is the spark of that divine within each individual. Regardless of sex, color, creed, nationality, anything, each individual encapsulates a spark of that divine. And fanning that spark of the divine into the blazing fire of spiritual realization is the real goal of life. Now, how do we join the Atman and the Brahman? The joining process is known as yoga. Because this word yoga is very commonly used simply to look upon as exercising. They're certainly there. But yoga means to join. It comes from the same root as the English word to yoke. Yoga is the methodology and philosophy of joining the Atman within with the all-pervasive Brahman. And there are four main paths of yoga. There is the Jnana Yoga, the Bhakti Yoga, the Karma Yoga, and the Raj Yoga. And I would like to spell these out a little for you. The Jnana Yoga is the way of the mind, the way of the discriminative intellect, the way of seeing the difference between what is real and what is unreal, what is passing and what is eternal. That capacity for very refined thought processes, that is the Jnana Yoga. Like in the West, Plato, for example, says that we are in a cave, all we see are shadows thrown on the wall of the cave. We neither see the objects nor the light behind the object. So similarly, the discrimination between what is real and unreal, Sat Asat Viveka, that is the Jnana Yoga, and that is the way of the mind. The mind which is refined by meditation, by interiorization, and by constant practice. The second part, the yoga, the main path, is the Bhakti Yoga. If Jnana Yoga is the way of the mind, Bhakti Yoga is the way of the heart. The heart is to open in love and reverence and affection for whichever form of the divine you prefer. There's nothing laid down. When fall in love, you have to fall in love with the divine. That's what you have to do in Bhakti Yoga. Whether it is Shiva, whether it is Krishna, whether it is Vishnu, whether it is Jesus Christ, whether it is anybody, whichever form of the divine you prefer, you have to fall in love with that. The heart has got to open in love and affection. That is the Bhakti Yoga. Because merely the mind is not enough to carry us. We need the heart also. We need the emotions also. Because remember, yoga is totality. It covers all the aspects of the human personality. So the Jnana Yoga, the way of the mind, the Bhakti Yoga, the way of the heart. That is why we have so many different forms of the divine. So many people are astounded how many gods and goddesses and all. They're all emanations of the same divine, remember. They may have different forms, but behind them is the power of the Brahman. So all the festivals, all the melas, all the temples, all of this is Bhakti Yoga. And Bhakti Yoga is a very powerful instrument of of spiritual growth. It began in the south with the Nayanmars, the Shaiva saints and the Alvars, the Vaishnava saints, and the whole Bhakti movement has come all the way up, whether it is Meera or Surdas or Tulsidas, all these great bhaktas, they are representatives. Or in the West, St. Francis of Assisi or St. Teresa of Avila, these are the great bhaktas. St. John on the Cross. So Bhakti is the second main path. The third main path of joining of yoga is the Karma Yoga, the way of the hands, the way of the arms. You see, some people began to feel that the only way to actually come in touch with the divine is to go into some cave, Himalayan cave, and spend all your life meditating. But that is not possible. In any case, the Himalayas now are not available so easily, and with all the pollution, it's no longer as clear as it was. So, this is the third point, that work itself can become an important process of spiritual development. But what sort of work? Not just any work. Well, everybody works. That doesn't mean everybody is a Karma Yoga. Karma Yoga is work that is dedicated to the divine. There is a verse in the Gita, Yata pravittir bhutanam yen sarvamedam jatam sakarmanat ababhyat siddhim vinditiva. By worshipping that power that is behind the universe with our work, we move towards perfection. So if our work is dedicated, not only for our aggrandizement, not only to make more money, not only to make our company record more significant, but if it is looked upon as a dedication, that work becomes an important way of spiritual growth. Karma Yoga. So Karma Yoga is a very significant, otherwise, it would not be relevant to our today. Everybody is doing something. Whether you're a student, whether you're in business, whether you're in politics, you're doing something. But if you can do it as an offering to your divine, to your form of the divine, it becomes important in our spiritual life. So Jnana Yoga, the way of the mind, Bhakti Yoga, the way of the heart, Karma Yoga, the way of the hands, and Raja Yoga, the way of breath. Now breathing is something we do even before we are born. We start breathing, and literally till our last breath, as long as we are alive. But breathing is, everybody breathes, no big deal. But if you can regulate your breathing, there's a whole science in Raja Yoga, whereby by regulating your breathing, you can tap into the hidden powers within the human body itself. It's a very detailed and complex thing, I won't go into the details, but we believe that there is a power based in the spine, 3.5 times around the spine, known as the Kundalini, the serpent power. And under certain circumstances, it can be aroused. And as it moves up the spine, it energizes chakras. And each chakra brings about a new level of human consciousness, and finally it bursts into the cortex. But apart from that, even simple breathing exercises are there. They're not only good for our mind, they're good for our bodies, and they're good for our emotions. Because if we do not have our breath under control, that means we cannot control either our body or our mind or our emotions. So the way of the breath. So I've put before you 4 different aspects of yoga, and taken together, these aspects address the intellectual, the emotional, the physical, and the psychic elements in the human personality. And remember, these yogas are not mutually exclusive. We can and should practice as many of these as we can. Everybody now has to be a bit of an Jnana Yogi. You have to at least read up something about the scriptures. You have to be a bhakta. You have some form of devotion you must have. You have to be a Karma Yogi. You must work dedicated in manner. And you have some kind of simple breathing exercise. So these are 3 important points. The all-pervasive Brahman, the Atman within us, and the 4-fold yoga joining together. Now I'll come to 3 other aspects which from the Vedanta which are tremendously important. One is the idea of the world as a family. A remarkable idea. Ayam nija paro vedi gananam laguchetasam Udara Charitanam tu Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. It's very often used nowadays. Vasudha Eva Kutumbakam. The world itself is the family. Now, can you imagine thousands of years ago, our rishis seated in their meditation were able to envisage that ultimately the human race is an indivisible whole. It's a remarkable feat of philosophical awareness. And therefore, if the world is a family, then ultimately we've got to move towards some kind of human understanding. I know today we're going in the opposite direction. All the global treaties are being torn up and it's a great tragedy. But ultimately, if we believe that all human beings are bound together by a spiritual link and are all members of the same extended family, that is a thought which we always have to keep at the back of our minds. And I think India has tried from time to time to work according to that. So Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is an important element. Next point is the essential unity of all religions. Ekam sat vipraha bahuda vadanti. This is a key phrase from the Rig Veda. Ekam sat, the truth is one. Vipraha, the wise, bahuda vadanti, express it in many ways. Now I would like to all of you to understand this, very important for young people particularly. It means that whatever path you may be following, if you are following a spiritual path, ultimately they all lead to the same goal. Let us say you have a group of 100 students and they belong to 10 different religious organizations or religious beliefs. There cannot be 10 different divines. Ultimately, if there is a divine force, it has to be the same. It can express itself in 100 ways, but the movement is the same. So this concept of the unity of all religions, this is so important because there has been so much bloodshed and hatred and misconceptions on the basis of religion still existing that have really caused disaster to the human race. So religion, instead of becoming a factor that binds people together, it is becoming a factor that divides people. So therefore, we have to be very clear on this. And the interfaith movement, if you remember, in 1872, the first Parliament of the World's Religions was held in Chicago. And that began the interfaith movement. In 1972, in Chicago again, the second Parliament was held, and many parliaments have subsequently been held. We've had many groups. There are many interfaith organizations. There are, I had something called the Temple of Understanding, a large number of them. But what we do is to bring people of different religious persuasions together in a dialogue. It's not a Shastra, it's not to prove the superiority of one group, one view or the other, just to understand. Because there's so much misconception now. The archetypes are in our mind. The Muslims are like this, the Hindus are like this, the Christians are like this. And before we even understand what is happening, we react. That is not something which we should accept. And in our constitution particularly, there's a strong stress on, and this is the correct interpretation of secularism, not the Western secularism, which revolved around the church and the state, but our secularism means sarva dharman samabhava, equal respect to all religions. And that flows from this Rig Vedic dictum, ekam sat vipraha bahuda vadanti. And the final point that I want to put before you is another concept of the Upanishad. Bahujana sukhaya, bahujana hitaya. The welfare of the many, the happiness of the many. Vedanta is not a simple creed which is only meant for the individual who's practicing it. It's not a selfish creed. We realize that we are part of nature. In the Atharva Veda, there is a Bhumi Suktam, 63 verses of the Atharva Veda, which contain the most holistic articulation of environmental values that you can get anywhere in the world. So we have this Bahujana Sukhaya Bahujana. Sarvepi Sukhina Santu. Sarve santu niramaya, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kashchitu prabhavaya. May everybody be happy. Sarve sukhina, sarve bhavatu. May everybody be healthy. May everybody see auspicious sights. May there be no hatred between Ma Vidvishami. What better prayer, what better definition of socialism? So, Bahujana Sukhaya Bahujana Hitaya. Unto this last, as Ruskin said, until every human being does not have basic necessities of life, we cannot preach philosophy to him. Vivekananda said, to preach philosophy to a man who is starving is an insult to him. First of all, fill his stomach and then give him your philosophy. It is unfortunate that even today, 70 years after independence, there are millions and millions of children who go to bed without a single good meal. There are millions of families who shiver in the winter, who are drenched in the monsoon, who sweat in the summer. We cannot afford this. If we really base ourselves upon the Vedantic principles, we've got to remove this poverty. Otherwise, we will not be living up to our ideal. So friends, this is what I want to point out for you. First of all, the Brahman and the Atman, the fourfold yoga, then the concept of the world as a family, the concept of the truth of all religions, essential unity of all religions, and the concept of the welfare of the many, happiness of the many. And I submit that if we accept this holistic and integrated view of life, it will help everybody, it will help India, it will help the world, it will help ourselves. And I hope that all the listeners that I have, particularly young people around the world, I want to give them a message of hope. I know that you are facing tremendous difficulties, the corruption that is all around, the difficulties that you face. I can imagine them. I've not been through them luckily, but I can imagine them. However, you must keep the faith. I am now 90, I will be 90 soon by God's grace. So you are just youngsters, you have all your life ahead of you. But keep the inner flame going. Do not go into dejection. And I will end with a very important verse from the Upanishads, from the Vedanta, which exhorts young people to awake and arise and walk across the razor-edged path. It is a difficult path. Life is not easy, friends. There are no shortcuts now, either to individual greatness or to collective emancipation. Across that difficult path, you have to go towards our goal. What is our goal? Our goal is a new society, new India, a new world, a new consciousness. So with that verse, I will end. Uttishtata, Jagrata, Prapya Varan Nibodata, Turasya Dhara Nishita Durattaya, Durgam Pathastat Kavayogata. Thank you. I think there's something wrong with your system. I can't hear you. Why don't Jyotiraditya ask the questions? I can't hear you.
Shalji,
इन्हीं की इससे वजह से गड़बड़
sure, sir. For the timing, I can begin with thank you so much, sir, for the fantastic talk. And I was really mesmerized by the point where you said that what does it mean to join, right? Like as in, what is yoga in essence? Like other than the fact that we all usually see yoga only as Hatha Yoga, which is the yoga of the body. I wanted to ask, what does it mean to join? On the one hand, we have something that is very tangible, the real world, which is objective for everyone who's looking at it. And on the other hand, we have soul or Atman, which is subjective to one's own understanding.
Yes. Well, the thing is,
please elaborate.
It is only by raising our level of consciousness that we can become aware of the deeper element around us. I know that this is tangible, but the divine apparently is also tangible because this is also an emanation of the divine. But we have to raise our level of consciousness. If we do that, If we do that either by meditation or by prayer, if we're able to develop our consciousness, then I think it will be easier for us to understand the possibility of interacting with the higher force.
Yes, sir.
It's difficult, I know, but there it is.
Yes, sir. Like, as in a sense, because we, from our childhood itself, we see that this notion that we have, we take it for as given that we all have a soul, because in our culture we are told that way. Like the way we are, like from the very childhood, they're told that you have an Atman, you have to look at everyone equally, etc., etc. But the thing is, sir, that when we are talking to someone who on a human level, it is difficult to explain. And I'm sure your today's talk has helped us to explain a few things to our colleagues. But at the same time, like, is there any way that we can think of soul or Atman from an objective point of view? Like,
Well, that
apart from raising ourselves to their level.
I think
Yes,
the
sir.
objective point of view really comes in the Bhakti Yoga. Because in the Bhakti Yoga, you have a symbol. For example, I am a worshipper of Shiva. So my bhakti is devoted towards Shiva. That in a way can become a tangible symbol of the divine. You do not have to have a form. Many people can concentrate on Om, for example. The word Om is very powerful. There are many groups like the Arya Samaj, the Sikhs and others who do not believe in images. Fair enough. They can also follow their own path, but they will also have to follow the path of inward interiorization. So images are not absolutely necessary, but in Hinduism we have this glorious profusion of images. We can choose. We choose whichever forms of the divine we like. I think it's a pity to give that up, but there are groups and there are religions that do not believe in, even Indic religions, the Sikhs don't believe in images and Arya Samajis don't believe in images. Fair enough. But they can still pursue the Jnana Yoga, they can pursue the Karma Yoga, they can pursue the Raja. And they can concentrate on the Om or on a sound if they don't want an image.
Sure, sir. Yeah, thank you so much. That was a fantastic answer. Shalji.
Am I audible now,
No.
Hema?
But your system, I think, has created a lot of disturbance.
Okay. Dr. Saab, I have a small question, and that is pertaining to the interrelationship of Bhagavad Gita and Vedanta. We also talk about karma, and Vedanta also talks about karma.
Yes, yes.
Just,
Yes, let me tell you. There are three main foundations of the Vedanta, Prasthan 3. The Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Brahma Sutras. These three are the three foundations of the Vedanta. Therefore, the Bhagavad Gita is also very important. It's one of the three foundations. The difference is that the Upanishads are Shruti. They are at a higher level, and Bhagavad Gita and the Brahma Sutra are Smriti. They come at another level, but they are tremendously important. And you are right, the Bhagavad Gita, in fact, calls itself an Upanishad. Bhagavad Gita Upanishad Brahma Vidyayam. It is not technically an Upanishad, but it seeks to become an Upanishad. It is tremendously important. I can one day give you a separate talk on the Bhagavad Gita.
we'll have it next time, sir. Now, from this, I get another small point is, if everything is Brahman, then what is the significance of karma?
Well, as I said, karma is one of the ways in which we can try and join our inner consciousness with the Brahman. Because the Brahman is everywhere, but we are not aware of it. When we are in our bodies or in our minds, we are not aware of the all-pervasiveness. So, as I have said, yoga is the methodology of joining the two, and karma yoga is a very important path of yoga. And without karma yoga, as the Gita says, nobody can exist without karma. So when you have to do karma, you may as well do it as a dedication to the Lord.
Right, sir. Another small question is, sir, this is not, of course, related to today's talk, but a general question which I had in mind. that you have received your PhD on the political thought of Sri Aurobindo. Now, how far was his political thought or thought as a general thing influenced by Vedanta?
It was, you see, he was very deeply influenced by the Upanishads. He has written marvelous commentaries on the Upanishads. On the Kena Upanishad, he has written 2 volumes on the other Upanishads. Originally, he was a freedom fighter. He was as you know, his life had 2 aspects. He was a freedom fighter. He was at the head of the first movement of the Indian National Congress in 1905, 1907. Then he became a yogi. And when he came to Pondicherry, his writings are deeply influenced. He has his own take, mind you. He has his own special formulation. But it is deeply influenced by the Upanishads. He's read them, he's written on them. And he's praised them. He said that there's nothing like them anywhere in the world. And Swami Vivekananda was even more directly influenced by them. Because he went straight on the Upanishads.
Jyotiraditya, you have any question?
Yes, sir.
Please, go ahead.
Sir, there's a question regarding the representation of females in Vedanta,
Yes,
in Upanishads. Because most of the examples that are given and most of the authors themselves, from what we perceive, were males. And in the sense that a lot of examples deal with a man's understanding of the world more than a female's understanding. And I do not know, I would love that.
Yes, I'll answer that.
That's how it can be made relevant for both groups.
The Upanishads are very clear. They're one of the few religious texts in the world that are very clear. They say, he is in the man, he is in the woman. He is in the boy, he is in the girl. There is no gender discrimination as far as the Brahman is concerned. Very clearly they lay it out. In verse after verse they say that he is in the man, he is in the woman. We also had some female saints. Gargi, for example, in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. I agree, most of the saints were men. But the teachings are universal and there is no discrimination. In fact, at the Kena Upanishad, it's a marvelous story. At the end of it, the goddess herself appears. Umam Hemavati, Uma, the daughter of the Himalayas, and tells the gods that their victory was not their victory, it was because of the Brahman. So the feminine is tremendously important. There is no view that men are superior to women. In fact, clearly they have said that the Brahman is equal in man or in woman. And even in the neutral, in the transgender, they say, also be there. They specifically mentioned that. So sex is certainly not a problem.
Yes, sir. I totally agree with what you said. That even though there are some aspects and some stories which have more mentions of male saints, etc.
Because mainly the students, because the students are mainly boys. No? They were male.
At that point in time.
That's why so most of them were stories.
Yes, sir. So do you think there's a requirement or some kind of clarification to be made to the female readers of Upanishads today that it...
Absolutely.
Who are amateurs?
I can't say that the females are as prominent in the Upanishads as the males. I cannot say that. But what I can say is that the teachings are purely gender neutral and that they're equally applicable to men or to women. And this whole question of sexual discrimination or sexual preference and all is ridiculous because the Brahman is in all people. And we cannot use sex in any way in a negative sense.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, there is a question not really related to your talk, which you have given today. And this is from one of our senior volunteers, Panchamji. He wants to know that spiritual liberation is achieved by eradication of ignorance or avidya and not by rituals. But our Hindu way of life is full of rituals from birth to death. Can we balance our quest for spiritual liberation while practicing rituals?
Yes, I think it is wrong to denigrate rituals. Rituals are very important. They may appear sometimes to be meaningless, but the rituals all have a deep meaning if you understand them. And I agree that ritualism is not good. In other words, simply to get involved in rituals all the time is not good. But the rituals themselves are significant. Whether they're rituals at birth, or rituals at marriage, or rituals at death. These are the three main events in human lives. And if you look at the prayers, for example, during a wedding, they're beautiful prayers, how the equality between the man and the woman, how they should treat each other and so on. If you look at the rituals at birth, they're also blessings to the child to become jnani. So rituals are to be respected. Ritualism is not desirable.
So you just talked about the concept of, a very old concept, Vedic concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Now, in today's world of strife and, rivalry and the fights going on territory, on political issues, how do we achieve this difficult task? Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam.
That is really an interesting point. Towards the end of the last century, it seemed as if we were moving towards globalization. Because the European Union, for example, came into being, which was a miracle. Thousands of years they had killed each other on the battlefields of Europe, and suddenly the European Union appeared. And the old currencies disappeared, a single currency. SAARC, various regional organizations. Lag raha tha that perhaps we are gradually going to move towards some kind of a global order. Unfortunately, it's been a throwback, a blowback in the 21st century. First of all, with Brexit, which was a black swan event. A black swan event is defined as an entirely unexpected event with momentous consequences. An entirely unexpected event with momentous consequences. First was Brexit. Who would have thought that the British suddenly would decide to shake the pillars of the European Union, which is such a great institution? The second, of course, was the election of President Trump. I mean, he went out of his way to break the international treaties. He said, I'm not a globalist. I don't like globalization. He cancelled many international treaties, went back on the Paris Agreement, which is a tragedy. And of course, then the COVID is the one black swan event to end all black swan events. I mean, suddenly this has hit us. So I agree with you, we're going through a very difficult period. I started off by saying that we are in a very uncomfortable period at this time. But nonetheless, we've got to keep our minds and our ideals clear. What is it that we ultimately want to achieve? We may not achieve it in our lifetimes.
This has actually almost become like a utopia today.
Yes, it is. I agree with you that to talk of globalization today sounds extremely unrealistic, and it is extremely unrealistic. But I have to mention it because it is one of the concepts built into the Vedanta.
That's right. That's
why I thought I have to mention.
Mm.
It may take a long time.
So you have recently written, I think, an article. Corona is here, but where is Corona?
Yes. You read that?
Where is Corona today?
Yes. You see, Karuna is compassion. If you remember when the Samudra Manthan took place, the original churning of the Milky Ocean, the Devas and the Asuras, and they thought a lot of gifts would appear, and suddenly this terrible poison appeared, the Garala. And it was only Lord Shiva who had the capacity to swallow that and integrate it into his throat, which turned blue, hence his name Nilakanta, that the world was saved. Now this time, once again, we seem to have this Garala. But Lord Shiva is not there yet, at least we should pray that he appears. I think each one of us, in the crucible of our own consciousness, we have got to develop the capacity to integrate the negativity that is around us. And that requires karuna, compassion. When we see pictures of these millions of our citizens walking back home, 500 kilometers, 1,000 kilometers, children, old women, with their luggage, it's a heart-rending situation.
That's right.
Unless we feel for them, really, we are incomplete human beings. And so that's why I said, where is the karuna? Karuna has to come. Each one of us has to develop that compassion. On the contrary, we are now going against the health workers. I mean, that is the depths of ignorance. The people who are risking their lives for us, उन्हीं के पीछे हम पड़ गए. We won't let them be buried, we won't let them come in. What is this? And what has happened to us as a nation? We cannot allow these sort of negativities to command the situation.
So, you think, sir, that out of this churning of the ocean, the barrel is come out. Is there a way out, or is there a hope of getting Amrit out?
Remember, originally it was only after the poison was integrated, then the great gifts started coming.
Nectar.
All the gifts, the
Amrita.
Keshavasa, the Kamadhenu, the Mahalakshmi, the Amrita and all. Now, whether after this corona thing we emerge as a better human civilization or not remains to be seen. We should. We've got a shock. Nature is hitting back at us. Whatever we are seeing around us, the pollution, the climate change, even these pandemics are part of nature's hit back because of the way we have mistreated last centuries. And we therefore have to rethink our relationship with nature, which can be helped with the Atharva Veda, as I told you. So to rethink our relationships between various religions. And some of the concepts of the Vedanta, I feel, if we can interiorize them during this crisis, perhaps we can emerge as fractionally better than we were before. That itself would be a great improvement.
So, is there a hope that the entire world, the country of the world, will come together to fight this pandemic, or there is no hope? They are fighting their own battles.
They are fighting their own battles. Mind you, in some ways they have come together. For example, the scientists all over the world are more or less working in tandem. They're all trying desperately to find a vaccine, whether it is Indian scientists or American scientists or Chinese scientists or, for that matter, British scientists. They are in a way an international community. But the political differences remain, I'm afraid. There's a lot of polarization now between America and China. We also have problems on our border. So, as I said, it's an uncomfortable situation now. But we must keep our balance and keep our inner integrity intact.
Sir, you know, SPICMAC is a youth movement.
I know.
And, you know, it depends on the youth, and they have been getting a lot of inspiration from you and your teachings, and your association with SPICMAC goes back to 40, 45 years, 43 years, right from its inception. Would you like to say a few things to the youth?
Well, in fact, all I have said is, in fact, just two things.
Yeah.
But I would particularly like to say that because I have grandchildren now who are young, and the young people, I think, as I said again, you've got to, may the force be with you. You've got to keep the force with you. Once you give up hope, then we're finished. You are the ones who are going to build the new world. Our generation has made a mess of things. That is why we are in this situation. But now it is your generation that is going to get things together, get rid of these ridiculous concepts, negative concepts that we have, superstitions and antagonisms, and move on to a broader unity of consciousness. If the young people of the world unite, then the world will be saved.
Jyotiraditya, do you have anything to ask? Dr. Saab se kuch
Yes,
puchna hai? Pucho.
Yes, sir, I do. And I also want to ask a few questions on behalf of our viewers on YouTube. So we have our first question by Chinmaya Arun Raja, who has asked that there are various darshanas under the umbrella called Vedanta, like Advait, spearheaded by Adi Shankaracharya, Vishishta Advait of Ramanujacharya, Dvait by Madhvacharya, etc. Yes, sir. They have slight differences in their views of the relation between man, God, and the universe. How difficult it is for a young Indian to understand these concepts?
It's a very intelligent question. Chinmaya has obviously studied his Shastras. There are these three main schools: the Advaita school, the Dvaita school, and the Vishishtadvaita school. I personally tend to favor the Vishishtadvaita, although I'm a Shiva Bhakta, but Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita, meaning there is unity, but there is also a difference. Shankara's is totally Advaita, which I find difficult to accept. But I don't want to force my own views upon anybody. I suggest that you find like whichever deity you want to worship, you can choose. Whichever one of these three appeals to you, you choose that one. And go according. Don't get too involved with the theology of the thing. And then the Vaad, Vivad and all other, you spend the rest of your life arguing about it. जो अच्छा लगे, जो आपको अच्छा लगे, जो देवता आपको अच्छा लगे, जो देवी आपको अच्छी लगे, आप उसको choose your God, choose your goddess, choose your philosophy.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Sir, actually, Chinmaya did ask a follow-up question, which was, should we try to understand all these systems to understand Vedanta? And to which
Yes, I think it'll be too difficult if you start understanding them all. Because they're all based on the Upanishads. They're different interpretations of the Upanishads. None of them contradict the Upanishads. But they say this is what the Upanishad means, this is what it means. You see, Sanskrit is a great language. And the verses can be interpreted in various ways. And these great philosophers have interpreted the Upanishads in the way that they thought suited their philosophy. And so don't get involved in trying to get anything. Just choose whichever way you think. Get on with it. Get on with your work, with your spiritual work.
thank you, sir.
Don't waste time.
Yes, sir. I have a follow-up question because now that we have got the Advait Vedanta part by Adi Shankara in the picture, I, as an amateur reader, I was reading the book Vivek Chudamani of Adi Shankaracharya.
Vivek Chudamani.
And yes, sir. And there is a verse which says that I do not know if I understood it correctly, but from what I felt, it said that it is you are lucky. It is rare to have a human body, so you should use it to find the truth. And moreover, you are even more luckier, and it is even more rare to have a male body.
No, yeah. There, I'm afraid Shankara has said that. I know he said that. I don't accept
Yes,
it.
sir. Yes, sir.
I don't accept it. He is
Yes, sir,
only-
because-
if you're born as a human being, and then if you're born as a male, I think what he was meant was in those days it was only the young boys who had the opportunity of going to the ashramas, of learning the Brahma-gyana. And the girls were mainly kept at home. And therefore perhaps the boys were luckier. But the way he put it, it doesn't sound too good, I must admit.
Sure, sir. Yeah, that's a very good clarification, sir. Because the readers of today, my friends who are girls from today, and even if I want to suggest my mother to read it, I do not want her to feel that she is at a lesser opportune
That is
position.
not in the Upanishad, remember. That's in Vivek Chudamani.
Yes, I know.
Shankara.
And that's
In the
why
Upanishads, you will never find a verse like that.
Yes, yes. I agree with you totally, sir. Sir, we do have people want to move on to your literary works.
Oh.
So if you allow me, I would like to read the list of your literary works. And
Don't do that. What is the use? You see, let us confine ourselves.
No, so that
To the Vedanta, because I've written on all sorts of things. I've written on travel. I've
Okay,
written
sir.
on philosophy. I've written on politics. I've written poems.
Yes,
I've
sir.
written a novel, and also let's not get involved in that. Let's just
Okay, sir.
concentrate on the Vedanta.
Okay, sir, sure. Then because there are people who are asking who are the people who have influenced your writing style, and why did you think of coming into poems and becoming a poet, etc.
Well, I can,
If you want to
I
give
can
a
talk
brief,
about that if you like. I mean,
sure, sir.
you know,
A little bit.
I loved writing from my childhood. My first essays on a visit to Sri Amarnath Shrine were published in 1952 in the Hindustan Times. 3 articles, The Glory of Amarnath. I was 21 years old then. So that means I've been writing for 70 years. And I've written, wherever I go, I've written on my travels. I like writing, I enjoy writing. I enjoy reading. if you're only, you can write well if you're a good reader. And I read, from childhood, I read such a lot. I read all the Sherlock Holmes books, all the P.G. Woodhouse books, all the great classics, The Three Musketeers, of War and Peace, then Aldous Huxley. Aldous Huxley was great. I was greatly influenced by Aldous Huxley and Bertrand Russell. These were two thinkers. When I was growing up, they were very influential. And Harold Lasky for politics. These were the three main people whose style I followed. And of course, my guru in some ways was Dr. Radhakrishnan. He was the one from whom I learned the capacity to speak, to weave Sanskrit into an English speech seamlessly, and to go back to the English. So my public speaking style or my political guru was Jawaharlal Nehru, and my intellectual guru was Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan.
Thank you so much, sir. I have a question for you that because we wanted to stick with Vedanta. So we have that you explained to us how we can share the notion of Bhakti Yoga as well as Karma Yoga to our fellow, even people who are not familiar with Vedanta. It is easier for them to understand these two concepts. That brings me to the question that what do you think about Gyan Yoga and Raj Yoga? Are there aspects of it which are also easier for people to comprehend and we can share and begin sharing with them?
Gyan Yoga, I've spoken about Gyan Yoga, and Raja Yoga is what I call the fourth, the royal path. They are not mutually exclusive. They're different paths. One deals with the intellect, and the other deals with the body. And there's no contradiction between them. I think if your body is fit and if you're well, and I'm so glad that yoga, in the sense that we know it now, has become so popular around the world. Yoga is not only Indian; it's a global phenomenon, and I think that whatever else may have happened, what this Prime Minister has done about making yoga International Day of Yoga, that is something which is certainly positive. So I see no contradiction between Jnana Yoga and Raja Yoga. They deal with different elements of the psyche. Jnana Yoga is intellect, Raja Yoga is the breath and the body.
Right, sir. But what aspects, do you think there are certain key messages from your understanding of Jnana Yoga and Raj Yoga which you believe can be easily translated, for anyone who is, for a normal human being?
I try to put those messages into my talk. I think that each person has got to take from it what they feel is useful.
Right.
One size fits all is not always working. People have different propensities. Some people may be attracted to the Jnana Yoga. Some people may prefer Bhakti Yoga. Some people may prefer the Raja Yoga. Let everybody choose. Let everybody choose which yoga or which combination of yogas you want to follow. But follow something.
Sure.
What I'm trying to say is, look into your inner life also. Apart from your outer career and your job and your salary and your family and so on, look inwards also. Don't just skim across life without plunging deep into the recesses of human consciousness.
Thank you so much, sir. Sir, you in your talk mentioned various new ways not new in the sense that which usually people do not talk about, like the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam part, internationally, I mean, like Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam part, the world is a family, and when they think of Hinduism, or the Ekam Sat Shloka, which talks about the concept of unity of all religions, or the Swadharma, Sambhava, Sarvadharman Sambhava part. But instead, I believe often Indians who go abroad, and if they identify the religion as Hindu, they get asked a question, there's a very narrow opinion on it. And from what, in my own experience and some of my friends, there were two things which stand out to people who are seeing Hinduism from an outside perspective. One is the fact that we are cow lovers, which we indeed are. And the second is the fact about casteism, sir. What do you have to tell to them?
Yes,
As in,
yes.
how can we?
Well, that brings in a whole new dimension. As far as the cows are concerned, there's a long story as to why cattle were useful, and with agriculture. I don't want to go into that controversy, but the cow has always been revered as a sacred animal, and the bull is the vahana, the mount of Lord Shiva. So they do have a certain special importance. I'm not getting into the other further thing. As far as casteism is concerned, unfortunately, it was one of the most undesirable developments in Hinduism. If you read the Upanishads again, there's very little about caste. In fact, there's a story of Satyakama where the boy said that he wanted to become a shishya. He goes to the Guru. Guru says, "What is your background?" So he asks his mother, this is in the Upanishads, "What is my background?" He said, "I cannot tell you that because when I was young, I was serving many different people. I do not know who your father is, and therefore my name is Jawala. Call yourself Satyakam Jaiba." He went back to the Guru and said, "I'm sorry, I cannot tell you my caste or my background, but this is what my mother said." He said, "Fine, I'll take it." So, it's one of the examples where, despite the later rigidities, and in the Upanishads, they're not all Brahmins. They're Kshatriyas also. There's Janaka, for example. There are many Kshatriya kings. Kshatriyas and Brahmins mainly, I agree. But the way I don't want to go into an explanation of the caste system. There are certain, how the priests who tended the fire, they were the Brahmanas. The warriors who as it were, secured and defended the tribe, they were the Kshatriyas. The merchants who did the commerce and trade, they became the Vaishyas. And the others who did the service occupation, they were Vaishyas. But that is how, I'm not going to go into a justification. Every single Hindu reformer, the first thing they have attacked is caste.
Yes, sir.
The first thing they attacked.
Yes.
Raja Ram Mohan Roy started his Brahma Samaj movement. Adi Brahma Samaj, Keshav Chandra Sen, Brahma Samaj, Devendranath Thakur, Adi Brahma Samaj, Keshav Chandra Sen, widow remarriage, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Bhandarkar and Ranade in Maharashtra, Swami Dayanand Saraswati in the Punjab, all of them, the first thing they attacked is caste. All the Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar or even the Mahatma Gandhi, the first thing that they attacked was caste. And Mahatma Gandhi's whole life was involved in trying to get rid of this caste dimension, particularly what were then known as Harijans, now the Dalits. So all enlightened Hindus realize that caste is a negative, a very cruel, and a totally unacceptable situation. You can, there's a negative. If you feel that you want to enjoy your caste, you can do so. But you cannot use caste to in any way dominate other people or humiliate other people. That is not acceptable.
Yes.
Example, a Brahmin may say, all right, I want to be like the enlightened Brahmins. Fair enough. But I am a Kshatriya, I can say I want to be like Vikramaditya or like Chandragupta Maurya, whatever. Chandragupta was not a Kshatriya, by the way. He was an OBC. So all our people are drawn from different castes. All the great figures. Even in our many, Narayana Guru, for example, in Kerala, was a great social reformer. Sri Vasava in Karnataka, Vasaveshwara, the whole Lingayat movement. These are all social reform movements of great importance. And all of them moved against what was the cruelty, or as it were, the Brahmin domination of our religion.
Yes. Sir, we do have a few more questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much for the fantastic answer, because that definitely clarified a lot of things for us, and it also gives us the confidence to talk to other people and explain to them that we are much more than casteism.
And untouchability is outlawed in our constitution against the law.
Yes, sir. Exactly. So we have two more questions as of now. We have a question from YouTube which says by our volunteer Yoshita, can the Advait Darshan be extended to other religions? I mean, if as a Christian I have to follow Advait Darshan, will it conflict with my religious beliefs?
Well, I would say that Advaita is broad enough to cover everything. As I said, whether you worship Krishna or whether you worship Christ, they are symbols of the divine. And I think if you're worshipping Jesus with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul, that's totally acceptable. I don't see any conflict between Advaita, between the philosophy of Advaita and your worshipping that particular form of the divine. We would look upon Jesus not as the only form of the divine. There is a difference there between the Semitic religions and the Indic religion. We accept all forms. We accept the Buddha. We accept Jesus Christ. The Abrahamic religions, I must say, have I don't want to use a negative word, but they have a little more rigid. No, if you're a Christian, this is the way you go. You can only worship Jesus, you can't worship anybody else. If you're a Muslim, you can only accept Muhammad and nobody else. If you're a Jew, you have to accept the Torah. That is not so in the Indic religion. There's a basic difference between the Indic religions and the Abrahamic religions, which I touched upon briefly when I said that we are a dialogic religion, not a revealed religion.
Right. Thank you, sir. Sir, Anish Mishra asks, coming back to the philosophical aspect of things, how did analytic philosophers like Bertrand Russell affect your thoughts on Indian philosophy?
Sorry, how did? I didn't catch the first.
Analytic philosophers like Bertrand Russell, yes, sir, affect your thoughts on Indian philosophy?
Well, they broadened my understanding of philosophy. Well, Bertrand Russell, as you know, he didn't accept any religion. Why I'm not a Christian, another essay, if you remember one of his books. But the way he wrote was so clear and so illuminating that it made a deep impact upon me. And his analytical capacity made me rethink a lot of things. So did Aldous Huxley, of course, was more Hindu-oriented than Bertrand Russell. But you see, any great philosopher, if you are able to understand what they're saying, you don't have to agree with what they say, but they can help to expand your mind. That's what happened to me with these people.
Thank you. So, to extend this question, I would like to ask, there have been analytical philosophers and analytical Navya, the concept of Navya in Sanskrit, like where which does talk about an aspect of analytical philosophy in some sense. Like, do you think there are some parallels in Indian philosophy which existed like 1,000 years ago or something like that, which can be drawn from what the Western philosophers do currently?
Well, they can be. If you go into a detailed study, there can be various, because various themes are there. The Sankhya had its own thing, and different schools of Hindu thought. They had their own ways, and they had the ways of. I think that you can get quite a lot in common. It isn't as if they're totally opposed to each other, because they are quests for truth. Remember, even the analytical philosophers apparently are looking for something, whether they're Marxists or whatever. Because the Marxists I find very negative because they don't accept any group of that nature, nonetheless. So I would say that philosophy as a family, as a branch of knowledge, there is a lot in common. They may appear to be very different, but when you get into the nitty-gritty, the methodology, you will find that quite a lot of common things.
Yes, sir. So I would like to follow up on it a little bit more, if you do not mind.
Okay, you can go on. How long have you been?
Yeah, sure. This is great, sir. So one thing that I want to say is, if you look at recent philosophers, Western philosophers who have taken inspiration in Indian philosophy, like Emerson, Thoreau, and the like, What do you think, sir, like Emerson and Thoreau?
Yes, yes.
Yes, sir. Like,
They were deeply-
what do you think were the aspects which were the most influential for them? Like, this is for a better understanding. Like, because I myself am an amateur student of philosophy. Like, I'm trying to learn.
Well, for example, Emerson, that his poem, if the red slayer think he slays, or the slain think he be slain, they know not well the subtle ways, I keep and pass and turn again. Far or forgot to me are near, shadow and sunlight are the same, the vanished gods to me appear, and one to me are shame and fame. Very Vedantic. There's a verse from the Kathopanishad which says exactly this. Or when Somerset Maugham wrote The Razor's Edge, he took that from that Surasya Dhara, the cloak with which I ended my talk. Surasya Dhara, Razor's Edge, took it from that. So they've learned a lot from Indian philosophy. They've learned from the gods and goddesses. They've learned from the concepts of the Upanishads. They've been deeply Emerson, Thoreau, and later on, of course, Huxley and other ones. Even Romain Rolland, French author, who wrote Jean-Christophe, that is a great book. He wrote biographies of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. So they were influenced by the teachings, also influenced by the people, by people like Ramakrishna, people like Ramana Maharishi, who was in Arunachal mountain, and people like Swami Vivekananda. They were influenced by them, by their lives. And by Gandhiji. Don't forget, Gandhiji was also an important religious leader. He was not only a political leader, he was a social reformer. And therefore he was a major figure in Hindu social reform.
Yes, sir. Sir, to conclude, what would be your final message, a summarized message for the youth all the youth today who are watching you today live and also in the recorded sessions, which will be streamed on a later time? What do you think is your one-line message to them?
My one-line message: keep well, keep safe. May the force be with you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Sir, we must thank you, sir. Yeah, I must thank Dr. Saab for his insightful and enlightening talk. And we didn't restrict our conversation or dialogue only to Vedanta. We took a whole lot of gamut of subjects under this sky, and you were very kind to answer them, should we say, patiently. And at times we were rather
I enjoy answering questions.
awry here and there, and we were not really.
I learn a lot from my questioners.
we were not really focused on your subject, but you were kind enough to answer all the queries, question that I had and Jyotiradit had. Jyotiradit is a bright person who had read probably a few Upanishads and books. And I must thank him also to be with us. And thank you very much, sir, on behalf of SPICMACAY and all of us. And thanks again, sir. We will
Thank you. Thank you, Parents.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Namaskar.
So I have a few announcements before we end today's session.
I can go
offline,
so, yes, sir. Okay.
So, Abhishek, Hemant, just keep Jyotiraditya for his announcements, and
yes,
you can.
I'm offline in any case.
Not yet, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Not yet.
Thank you, sir. Namaskar.
बंद कर दूं इसको.
Richa Anirudh, who is the founder of Zindagi with Richa. We have a video message by Srimati Richa Anirudh, journalist and SPICMACAY, journalist and SPICMACAY volunteer in the past. I would give the stage to Hemant for this. And also, I would request all the people to wait for 2 minutes after seeing the message, and refresh your browsers for the next session to begin at 3:30 p.m. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
नमस्कार, कैसे हैं आप सब लोग? मेरा नाम ऋचा अनिरुद्ध है और बहुत बहुत शुभकामनाएं अनुभव 2020 के लिए। स्पिक मेके से मेरा बहुत पुराना रिश्ता है। 1990 या 91 में जब मैं स्कूल में थी, क्लास 11-12 में, तब से मैं स्पिक मेके की वॉलंटियर हूँ। अपने स्कूल के चैप्टर को संभालती थी। उसके बाद कॉलेज में भी स्पिक मेके के साथ जुड़ी रही। 1996 में डॉक्टर किरण सेठ के कहने पर मैंने स्पिक मेके का ऑफिस संभालना शुरू किया और वो मेरे ख्याल से पहली बार था जब स्पिक मेके को एक प्रॉपर ऑफिस मिला था। तो करीब 1 साल मैंने एज प्रोफेशनल भी काम किया स्पिक मेके के साथ और उसके बाद फिर मैं अजमेर गई तो वहाँ पर मैं वहाँ का चैप्टर संभालती रही। तो आप समझ सकते हैं कितना पुराना रिश्ता है। कई नेशनल कन्वेंशंस अटेंड किए हैं, बहुत सारे आर्टिस्ट के साथ कोऑर्डिनेट किया है, उनके सर्किट्स बनाए हैं, स्टेज तैयार किया है, इंस्ट्रूमेंट्स उठाए हैं। और मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि आज जब भी मैं अपनी ज़िंदगी में पीछे मुड़कर देखती हूँ, सो एक बहुत बड़ा हिस्सा होता है स्पिक मेके का आपकी पर्सनालिटी को शेप करने में। तो वही मेरे साथ भी हुआ। जब स्कूल में 11-12 में पहली बार जब मुझे स्पिक मेके के बारे में पता चला, डॉक्टर किरण सेठ हमारे स्कूल में आए थे, तब तक मुझे नहीं लगता, मतलब मुझे संगीत में दिलचस्पी थी। मैं फिल्मी गाने बहुत सुनती थी बीइंग यंग स्टूडेंट, लेकिन क्लासिकल की समझ भी नहीं थी, कोई उतना बताने वाला भी नहीं था। 1-8 साल खुद सीखा था वोकल, लेकिन मुझे लगा कि उसके बाद स्पिक मेके ने सिर्फ संगीत नहीं, मुझे ज़िंदगी की बहुत सारी सीखें दी हैं। बहुत सारे बड़े बड़े दिग्गज कलाकारों को बिल्कुल सामने बैठकर सुनने का मौका मिला है, लेकिन उसके साथ साथ जो मैं कह रही हूँ कि संगीत के साथ जो संस्कार मिले हैं कि आपको कैसे संगीत सुनना चाहिए, जब एक कलाकार आपके सामने हो तो उन्हें कैसे सम्मान देना चाहिए, वो चीज़ें जो साथ में आई स्पिक मेके के, वो मुझे लगता है कि सिर्फ एक श्रोता होकर शायद मैं नहीं सीख पाती, इस संस्था ने मुझे बहुत सिखाया। आप सब स्टूडेंट्स हैं, ये बहुत स्ट्रेसफुल टाइम है, बहुत सारे लोग दुनिया भर में जो भी ये अनुभव 2020 को सुन रहे हैं, मैं यही कहना चाहूँगी कि एक बहुत अच्छा मौका है, स्पिक मेके का बहुत अच्छा ये इनिशिएटिव है, इसका पूरा फ़ायदा उठाएं, क्योंकि इन स्ट्रेसफुल टाइम्स में जो सबसे मददगार चीज़ हमारे लिए साबित हो सकती है वो यही है, शुद्ध संगीत, अच्छा संगीत सुनिए। मुझे याद है पंडित रविशंकर जी के साथ जब मैं थी तो कई बार पंडित जी या चिन्नम्मा जो उनकी वाइफ है वो ये कहती थी कि तुम लोग ये सब मत किया करो, यहाँ का म्यूज़िक वहाँ का म्यूज़िक, देयर इज़ जस्ट गुड म्यूज़िक, और वो सुनो, अच्छा संगीत सुनो जहाँ का भी सुनना है। और मुझे लगता है कि हमारा इंडियन कल्चर, हमारी हेरिटेज, हमारा म्यूज़िक इतना बड़ा ख़जाना है कि हम सारी ज़िंदगी सुनते रहें तो भी हम उस ख़जाने को खाली नहीं कर पाएंगे। इतने महान कलाकार अनुभव 2020 के साथ जुड़ रहे हैं, प्रधानमंत्री ने इतना खूबसूरत संदेश दिया है। सो मुझे लगता है इट्स अ वेरी ब्यूटिफुल अपॉर्चुनिटी फॉर ऑल ऑफ अस, सो एंजॉय टू द फुलेस्ट। और जो मैं लगातार बार कह रही हूँ वही चीज़ कि सिर्फ संगीत को सुनिए मत, उसके माध्यम से आपको जो बहुत सारी चीज़ें सिखाई जा रही हैं उनको भी आत्मसात कीजिए। जब आप इन कलाकारों को सुनते हैं ना, तो कई बार अपनी परफॉर्मेंस के शुरुआत में, बीच में या बाद में ये कलाकार बड़ा खूबसूरत संदेश देते हैं, कोई छोटी सी सीख दे जाते हैं। हो सकता है वो एक सेंटेंस हो लेकिन आपको याद रह जाए। तो मेरी सलाह होगी कि जितने भी कलाकारों को सुनने के लिए आप लोग जुड़े हैं उनको बहुत ध्यान से सुनिएगा, क्या पता ज़िंदगी की कौन सी सीख वो आपको दे जाएं। थैंक यू, ऑल द बेस्ट, मेरी बहुत सारी शुभकामनाएं आप सबको।